Detectives are looking at two entirely different stories about the night Lynette Hooker vanished. One account came from Brian Hooker, the other was pulled from his own device. And according to federal agents close to this case, those two narratives simply do not match. Think about what that actually means. This entire mystery began as what looked like a devastating accident out at sea. A husband and wife, a tiny dinghy, pitch black water, a sudden fall overboard, and a frantic rescue effort that ended with him returning alone. But as investigators dug deeper, that simple explanation hit a wall it could not get around. Cold, hard data. No rumors, no online theories, just raw data. A marine navigation app tracking silent movements, combined with an 11-hour blackout from the yacht's tracking system. A sailboat seized by federal agents. And an infrared camera recording in the dark, capturing everything while nobody even realized it. Right now, deep inside a high-tech FBI forensic lab, agents are picking apart digital evidence recovered from the vessel at the center of this mystery.
Trying to solve a puzzle that has grown far more disturbing as the days pass.
The real question is not where Lynette is, but if the official story of her disappearance holds any truth at all. And everything begins with a single specific timestamp, 9:29 p.m. April 4th, 2025, in the Bahamas. That is when the sailboat's soulmate went completely dark on maritime tracking systems. For the next 11 hours and 11 minutes, no one on the outside knew where that boat went. Nobody knew what happened on board. No one knew what transpired during the crucial window that detectives are now focusing on. Then the tracker suddenly pinged again. The sailboat reappeared, but Lynette was gone forever. And the evidence agents uncovered next changes everything we thought we knew about this disappearance. Before we go on, this story details an ongoing missing person investigation with highly sensitive details. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. To understand why detectives are so fixated on that 11-hour gap in time, we must go back to the very beginning, to the ultimate retirement dream that originally drew Lynette and Brian Hooker out to the Bahamas. Long before agents began analyzing digital GPS records, before federal agents impounded the soulmate, before forensic examiners started pulling data in a secure federal lab, there was an entirely different narrative, a picture-perfect life that seemed flawless from the outside looking in. Spring 2025, the Bahamas, crystal blue water and quiet harbor towns. Days were measured by shifting tides and open horizons instead of hectic work schedules. For Lynette and Brian Hooker, this was no temporary escape. This was home. For years, they had been working toward a goal most couples only dream of: shedding their old lives, buying a boat, and sailing off into the sunset. Their yacht was named Soulmate, a floating residence, a retirement fantasy built on the water. According to close friends and relatives, and their own social media videos, sailing was not just some hobby, it was their entire world. They spent years sharing their journey, fixing up the vessel, cruising, and living on board. Clip after clip showed the couple working side by side, painting the decks, maintaining the engine, and mapping out their next grand voyage. Navigating deep waters, visiting quiet coastal towns, plotting their next stop. Lynette seemed completely at ease on the water. No novice to the sea, she was not just trying out this lifestyle. This was a woman who lived it for years. A wife, a mother, a seasoned sailor. Someone who traded a routine life on land for something far more unpredictable, but deeply liberating. For years, this appeared to be the exact life she had always wanted. In one video, Lynette smiled while soulmate ready to leave Texas for the open sea. "We are finally leaving Kima," she said excitedly as the journey began. Right then, it truly felt like the beginning of a fresh chapter. No viewer could have guessed where this story would lead, because somewhere along the line, the couple slowly transformed into something almost symbolic. They were the ones who broke free, who truly escaped. No desk job, no heavy traffic, no boring routine. Only a boat, the sea, and a new destination waiting just beyond the horizon. By early 2025, their journey had brought them straight to the Bahamas. The Hookers spent years sailing across the Caribbean and navigating coastal waters, documenting their adventures online for others to follow. To anyone watching, it seemed idyllic, almost perfect. Yet, what makes this mystery so haunting is that every single photo from before Lynette vanished feels totally disconnected from the reality that followed. When detectives finally started piecing together what happened on April 4th, they did not see some suspicious boat tangled in a crime scene. They saw the exact same vessel that took a retired couple on endless adventures. The very boat featured in happy family photographs.
The ship they called home. That stark contrast is everything.
This dark mystery does not start at a typical crime scene. It starts with a couple heading back from land on a perfectly normal ride to their boat. A brief trip so mundane that neither of them suspected. It would be the very last night anyone saw Lynette Hooker alive. According to her husband Brian, everything fell apart between Hopetown and Soulmate on April 4th, 2025. Hopetown is one of the most beautiful spots in the Bahamas. Vibrant cottages, narrow streets, and crystal clear water make this the absolute perfect place to escape from daily life. For Brian and Lynette Hooker, this was meant to be a simple stop on the lifestyle they had enjoyed for years. As dusk approached, the pair got ready to leave land and go back to their sailboat, Soulmate, which sat anchored offshore. Nothing about this short journey seemed suspicious. In fact, they had probably made this quick trip countless times. To commute between the shore and their yacht, they used a small dinghy measuring just 8 feet long. A simple watercraft meant only for quick trips, not built for long voyages or crossing open water at night. Just a straightforward tool to get back to their home. According to Brian Hooker, the two of them left Hopetown around 7:30 that evening. The light was already fading. As the sun slipped past the horizon, conditions out on the open water grew increasingly dangerous. Brian later reported rough sea conditions. Winds picked up and the weather rapidly turned. These details are crucial because, by his account, the next moments unfolded in seconds. Somewhere in the black water between Hopetown and the Soulmate, Lynette Hooker went overboard. Brian's story has remained pretty much the same. He claims Lynette slipped and fell, and that she was holding the dinghy's ignition key when she hit the water. And, according to him, when she slipped beneath the dark waves, that key went down with her. That one detail would become the absolute core of his entire story. Because, as Brian tells it, no key meant a dead engine. And with no motor, he had no real way to quickly go after her in the dark. Instead, he claims he tried rowing to reach her. He later talked about his desperate struggles to turn back and save her, but he claims the heavy winds and strong currents kept dragging them further apart. Each second widened the gap. Every minute swallowed her chances of survival. Eventually, he says, she vanished in the dark completely. Think about the puzzle investigators had to piece together right then. A lone husband drifting in a tiny dinghy on pitch-black open seas. A dead engine, no trace of Lynette, 0 witnesses, and absolutely no cameras. No objective record existed of what actually went down during those critical minutes. On the surface, it seemed like a horrific boating accident. The sort of tragedy that strikes in a flash, leaving behind nothing but painful, unanswered questions. Yet, from the very start, detective work turned up details that just didn't add up. Why did Lynette have the starter key? And when exactly did she go overboard? How long did Brian actually search for her? And which path did his boat really take? And, more importantly, what did he do during those missing hours afterward? Because Brian claims that after losing Lynette, he spent hours battling the sea alone. As the hours dragged on through the deep night, he finally drifted towards Marsh Harbor. He finally made landfall in the early morning of April 5th. Right then, the investigation looked like everyone's absolute worst nightmare. A tragic boating accident, a missing wife, a shattered husband, and an urgent search underway. But police soon uncovered a piece of evidence that completely broke the timeline wide open. Something that happened while Lynette was still lost out there. An event logged down to the precise minute, 9:29 p.m. That was the exact second the Soulmate went completely dark on GPS tracking. At the start of the probe, detectives focused on one simple, direct question. Where was Lynette Hooker? But as time wore on, a much darker question started surfacing. This new question had absolutely nothing to do with witness statements, police interrogations, or the reliability of human memory. It all came down to a single timestamp, 9:29 p.m. While detectives were mapping out the timeline of April 4th, they made a shocking discovery. This clue would eventually become the most contested piece of evidence in the whole case. The boat suddenly stopped broadcasting its position. To understand why this is a big deal, we have to look at a system few civilians know about. That tracker is known as AIS, the Automatic Identification System. Just think of it as a boat's unique digital footprint. Its digital footprints on the Blackwater. This system, known as AIS, constantly broadcasts a boat's identity, its precise position, heading, and speed. Nearby ships track it, Receivers on the shore map it. Global maritime networks watch its every move. Crucially, these tracking networks archive everything, every single transmission, course change, and recorded coordinate.
For detectives, this data is gold because human memory is notoriously fragile.
Witnesses get confused. Their stories change as the days pass. But digital tracking records do not lie. They plot movements in real time, minute by minute, coordinate by coordinate, which is exactly why the events of April 4th raised immediate alarms. Maritime records analyzed by detectives confirmed that Soulmate was pinging normally throughout the entire evening. Then, at precisely 9:29 p.m., the feed went dark. Not 9:28, not around 9:30, specifically 9:29 p.m. This extreme precision is vital because detectives aren't looking at some vague, fuzzy timeline.
They are focused on one exact second, an instant that aligns perfectly with the night Lynette Hooker vanished.
On the surface, that seems unremarkable. After all, technology fails all the time. Feeds drop, devices glitch. But detectives immediately spotted a glaring issue. AIS transponders are built to run non-stop, especially under the exact conditions sailors encounter at night. Pitch black skies, thick fog, shifting storms. These are the exact moments AIS was made for. That is why investigators focused not just on the missing person, but on this sudden, unexplained digital silence. Because the moment that feed died, a new mystery began. A massive, unexplained gap opened in their timeline. From that second on, the automatic tracking record simply vanished. The boat could no longer be tracked using standard maritime networks that had mapped its journey earlier that night, and the timing was impossible to ignore. According to her husband, Brian Hooker, Lynette was already in the dark water by then. She had already vanished. The desperate hunt for answers was already underway. Yet, right at this crucial moment, the vessel's digital trail suddenly became impossible to follow. Naturally, detectives demanded answers. Was there a logical explanation? Was this a critical clue directly tied to her vanishing? Or was it just a terrible coincidence, happening on the worst night of their lives? These questions grew heavy as the investigation widened, because every seasoned detective knows that timelines are absolutely everything. In cases like this, the timeline is the entire case. Forget what people recall or what they think happened. What matters is what can be pinned to a clock, verified, measured, and proven. Now detectives held an undeniable timestamp, 9:29 p.m. The exact second Soulmate vanished from tracking screens. The instant this complex investigation grew infinitely more tangled. And crucially, the start of a black hole that detectives still cannot explain with AIS data alone. Because once the signal died, the ship went completely dark. No fresh coordinates, no digital footprints, absolute silence. As the hours crept by, the darkness only deepened. The search for Lynette quickly intensified.
And out on the dark Abacos waters, the Soulmate slipped past the very maritime tracking networks that had been logging its every move just hours before.
But the next morning, everything changed. The vessel's signals suddenly reappeared. When investigators finally dug deep into those missing hours, they realized this tracking blackout was just one piece of a far bigger puzzle. Another source of digital data had been quietly recording that night, and what it captured raised a whole new set of disturbing questions. By this point in the case, police were no longer dealing with a simple missing person investigation. Instead, they were staring at a timeline with a massive hole in it. And not just any gap, a massive 11-hour silence. The exact kind of gap detectives notice instantly, because it lands right in the dead center of the most critical window in the case. Let us return to that exact timestamp, 9:29 p.m., when the Soulmate's tracking signal went totally dead. Then, according to official maritime tracking, later analyzed by police and reporters, the boat stayed completely off the radar until roughly 8:40 the next morning, 11 hours and 11 minutes. Absolutely no public tracking data. No digital trail showing where the yacht traveled during those hours, just a starting point and a destination. To detectives, that massive gap became critical evidence itself. Not because a dark signal automatically proves guilt. It doesn't. But because every criminal case rests on one fundamental truth. When key evidence vanishes during the absolute peak of a timeline, detectives have to find out why. Consider what police were dealing with. A woman had vanished. Her last known moments were at sea, and the main boat tied to the mystery suddenly stops broadcasting its location.
And this silence starts during the exact same critical window
that detectives are desperately reconstructing.
Naturally, they demanded answers because tracking systems aren't just a convenience for boaters.
They exist for safety, navigation, spatial awareness, and ultimate accountability.
At any single moment, tracking tools let ships identify each other, prevent collisions, and log travel across open waters.
That is why ocean investigators look so closely at these logs.
Electronic tracking data is often the closest thing investigators get to an unbiased witness. Not a human story, not a biased statement, just a machine quietly plotting coordinates in real time.
Which is exactly why a missing log is so suspicious.
Especially when investigators are trying to pin down exactly where a ship was during a crucial window. As media coverage of the mystery began drawing national attention, legal experts started sharing their thoughts on this sudden blackout. One key voice was former federal prosecutor Tad DiBiase, whose legal perspective carried immense weight for one major reason.
DiBiase is not just some TV talking head discussing a popular story.
He spent decades prosecuting high-profile trials, focusing on cases where physical proof and timeline tracking were vital. More importantly, he is famous for handling no-body homicide cases, investigations where prosecutors have to prove a murder took place even when a victim is never found. When DiBiase examined the public evidence in this case, he focused on a question detectives always ask right at the start. Where exactly was the boat? Not where someone remembers it, and certainly not where they claim it was later. Where was it physically located?
That distinction matters because every major investigation has two distinct timelines, the one people report and the one detectives can actually verify.
Sometimes those timelines align. Other times, they do not. When those paths diverge, detectives start digging a lot deeper. DiBiase publicly called the AIS blackout suspicious because of when it happened.
So close to the exact window detectives are trying to piece together.
Again, that observation does not actually prove guilt. It's not proof of a crime, but it explains why detectives keep focusing on that blackout. Because when you are trying to reconstruct a disappearance at sea, GPS tracking data is absolute gold.
You need to know where those vessels traveled,
when they stopped, when they moved, and if the data backs up or contradicts the stories told. The big problem here is that the AIS tracking suddenly goes dead silent.
Then, hours later,
the signal returns, almost like someone tore a chapter straight out of a book. You know what happened before, and you know what happened after, but the middle is totally blank.
And those missing pages happen to cover the exact time frame detectives need to understand.
What was the soulmate doing? Where exactly was it? What actually happened on board during those dark hours? At this point, detectives still lacked answers, but they did have one critical lead. They had a compelling reason to look beyond basic AIS data. Because even though the boat's main tracking system had gone silent, detectives would soon discover a different kind of digital evidence that recorded all night long. Evidence that was never meant to be part of this story. Evidence that reportedly came directly from Brian Hooker's personal device. And unlike the AIS log, this data did not vanish for 11 hours. In fact, it might have captured a completely different version of events.
Up until now, detectives had been dealing with a black hole of information.
An 11-hour gap, a window where the tracking signals of the soulmate vanished from the record.
But then the case took a massive turn when authorities uncovered something else.
Something that was never supposed to be a part of this story.
A hidden digital trail that had been quietly recording in the background.
And unlike the AIS, this trail did not stop at 9:29 p.m. According to reports on the case, federal agents pulled data from a marine navigation app installed on one of Brian Hooker's devices. To see why that matters, you have to understand how these apps actually work. Modern boating apps are basically digital chart plotters. They help captains map routes, track boat locations, and monitor movement on the water. But many do something else too.
They log data automatically, silently, in the background.
The user does not even need to set a route or manually save their location. The app continuously logs exactly where the device has traveled, creating a digital breadcrumb trail of movement. And that digital log would become a massive break in the entire case. Because, according to CBS News, investigators managed to pull GPS location data from a device linked directly to Brian Hooker. This digital footprint showed clear movement across the water the night Lynette vanished. But more critically, sources close to the probe revealed that these tracking logs did not match the maps Brian handed to detectives. That discrepancy is absolutely massive. Because up to then, detectives were only chasing a spoken narrative. It was Brian's story, his own memory of the locations, and his timeline of events. Now, there was a silent witness, one that didn't rely on human memory. This evidence wasn't pieced together later. It was automatically logging every coordinate in real time as the drama unfolded. Suddenly, police weren't just weighing one person's word against another. They were testing a story against hard data. And reports suggest those two versions of that fateful night simply didn't match up. Consider what that actually means for a homicide detective. Think about reconstructing a complex crime scene. A suspect tells you where they stood, but video surveillance puts them somewhere entirely different. That's precisely the kind of red flag investigators latch onto. Not because it proves guilt immediately, but because contradictions demand answers. Those answers require verification, and that verification brings detectives closer to the truth. For this case, the main question was simple. If the digital timeline contradicts the route he gave police, which version reveals the truth? His spoken story or the digital trail? And if there's a gap, what caused it? These puzzles are even more critical at sea, where precise coordinates are everything. Unlike city blocks, the open ocean washes away physical evidence instantly. No street corners, no security cameras, no eyewitnesses, and zero traffic records. Out in the deep water, GPS tracking is often the only objective tool detective work has. It maps out timelines, movement patterns, abrupt stops, course corrections, and vital search zones. That is why forensic teams put immense trust in untampered digital data. The sea easily swallows physical clues, but digital footprints can survive. Reports show that the retrieved GPS coordinates traced the device deep into the Sea of Abaco, halting before sailing back to the docks. Investigators reportedly concluded that this recorded pathway simply did not match the maps Brian Hooker had originally provided. But at this point, we must look at what the digital records do not reveal. The raw numbers cannot show detectives what actually happened to Lynette Hooker. It doesn't prove a motive. It doesn't establish criminal intent, and alone it cannot explain why those two routes differ. Yet, it handed investigators something they absolutely had to find. An unbiased record, a completely separate version of that timeline. Untouched by personal interviews, shifting memories, or convenient excuses. When detectives are handed two conflicting stories of the same night, they don't pick sides. They pressure test both, because the truth usually hides somewhere in the middle. And now, the entire search was starting to shift. The focus had shifted far beyond the disappearance itself. They were zoning in on the hard evidence, the AIS blackout, navigation logs, and timeline gaps. Every new piece of data kept pointing detectives toward the exact same spot. Right back to the soulmate. Because the deeper they dug into that digital trail, the more they believed the vessel itself held the very answers they were searching for. By now, federal investigators weren't just dealing with one unexplained disappearance. They had a mountain of digital evidence, including that AIS blackout, the navigation records, and those glaring discrepancies in the timeline. As those pieces began to stack up, the focus of the entire search shifted back to the one constant from the very beginning, the soulmate itself. Because if Lynette Hooker went missing during the timeline Brian Hooker described, then that sailboat wasn't just a piece of the puzzle. It was central to everything. Every coordinate, every onboard system, and every shred of tech suddenly mattered, and federal agents treated it with that exact urgency. In early May, federal agents seized the soulmate. For the first time since Lynette vanished, investigators had absolute control over the vessel and everything inside it. That single move tells us a great deal. Federal agencies don't just confiscate and search a yacht this size just because it happened to be there. They do it when they believe the boat holds critical clues to reconstructing exactly what happened. By this point, rebuilding the timeline had become their primary mission. No guessing and no assumptions. Just facts. Investigators needed to know where the boat traveled, which onboard systems were active, what data got logged, and if any of it could finally explain those gaps in the timeline. Initially, they kept the boat in Florida, but later moved it to a specialized facility for a deep forensic search. That might sound like routine paperwork, but it shows that investigators were planning something far beyond a routine inspection. They were gearing up for a massive top-to-bottom forensic investigation. Think about the tech on a modern yacht: navigation tools, GPS systems, marine electronics, communication devices, and computers. Hard drives, apps that track location history, and systems that automatically generate log files. Most people still view boats as purely mechanical machines.
But modern yachts operate more like floating data hubs.
Every single voyage leaves a trail. Every device leaves a digital footprint, and detectives wanted all of it. Because unlike human memory, digital logs don't fade with time. They don't forget. They never change their stories months later. If properly saved, they give investigators a concrete timeline that can be thoroughly tested.
That is exactly why the soulmate became so crucial.
Not because investigators thought the vessel itself had answers, but because the technology inside it did. And that distinction is vital. A ship cannot talk, but its systems can. Its navigation logs can. Its hard drives can. But its stored records can. In complex cases, especially when someone vanishes at sea, investigators rely heavily on technology to bridge the gaps where human memory fails. And in this case, those gaps were massive. Questions about movement, questions about timing,
Questions about location. Questions that could finally be answered by cold data instead of fragile memories.
When federal agents started combing through the vessel, they zeroed in on exactly those kinds of systems. Navigation logs, personal electronic devices, digital hard drives, anything that could track what happened before, during, and after Lynette went missing. Their objective was clear: construct the most precise timeline possible. Minute by minute, movement by movement, coordinate by coordinate. Because somewhere in that data trail, investigators believed the truth lay hidden. Then, investigators shifted their focus to one specific device aboard the Soulmate. A system that might have been recording while everything else was going down. A device that doesn't need daylight to see. A sensor that operates silently, whether anyone knows it's there or not. And a tool that, if active that night, might have captured moments no one realized were being filmed. By this point, detectives had assembled key pieces of a highly complex puzzle. They had the AIS blackm. They had GPS data recovered from onboard electronics. They had a timeline full of holes, and they had seized the Soulmate itself. But another piece of gear on that boat was drawing intense interest. An instrument that functions completely differently from standard navigation units, GPS, or tracking devices. Unlike those tracking tools, this one doesn't log where the yacht travels. It records what it observes, or more precisely, what it detects. The technology is known as FLIR, short for forward-looking infrared. Many seasoned mariners use FLIR systems as an extra layer of safety when sailing at night. To understand why, picture yourself standing on a sailboat deck in complete darkness. No streetlights, no city skyline, no visible landmarks, just the open water. Standard cameras struggle in these conditions because they depend on visible light. But thermal imaging works differently. Instead of recording light, it tracks heat. Everything gives off heat: the ocean, other vessels, and of course, human bodies. A thermal camera translates those temperature variations into a clear image, revealing details completely invisible to the human eye. That is why FLIR systems have grown popular with mariners navigating after sunset. They can help spot nearby vessels, hidden hazards, debris floating in the water, and under certain conditions, even a person in the dark. For detectives, that immediately raises one glaring question. Was the thermal imaging system operating aboard the Soulmate on the night Lynette Hooker disappeared? And if it was, what did it capture? At this point, we must be extremely careful to separate known facts from speculation. Because this is where speculation easily outruns the actual evidence. We do know that investigative reports indicate the Soulmate was equipped with an infrared camera system. And we also, here is what we know. Federal agents impounded the boat and immediately began scanning the onboard electronics they recovered. Several reports suggest that critical data salvaged from the boat is currently being analyzed under a federal microscope. But what remains hidden from the public is whatever that camera actually recorded. If there is footage, investigators are keeping it classified. They have not dropped a single detail about the video, nor have they shared what the infrared system analysis revealed. That detail is absolutely vital, because this thermal camera matters, not for what we know it saw, but for what it was capable of capturing in the dark. Consider the massive hurdle facing these detectives. The critical moments of this mystery supposedly played out after dark, far out at sea, with zero witnesses around. No security cameras nearby, no public lens tracking that dark patch of water. These conditions make gathering real proof nearly impossible. But an active infrared camera, that changes the entire playbook. It has no memory to fail, and no bias to twist what happened. It just captures the cold facts of whatever crosses its lens.
That is exactly why federal agents want to crack open every device on board, searching for a way to verify,
dispute, or make sense of the timeline. At this stage, the probe was far bigger than a simple missing person case.
Federal agencies had stepped in.
Digital files were being reviewed, and electronic records were carefully analyzed.
And based on reports surrounding the mystery, some of that data was sent to high-tech labs specialized in deep digital forensics.
The main objective never shifted: find out exactly what happened on the night of April 4th. But detectives were no longer leaning on just one piece of the puzzle. They were piecing the timeline together from several different angles.
AIS tracking, GPS coordinates, personal devices, and maybe even thermal imaging.
Each source gave them a fresh layer of clues,
allowing investigators to double-check every claim, because that is how you solve a complicated case.
one digital footprint at a time.
One file at a time, one proven fact at a time. By this phase, detectives held something they desperately needed at the start of the case: not definitive answers, but clear options. They had varied streams of proof, countless ways to map out the night, and plenty of chances to see which parts of the story add up and which ones are still missing.
Agents now held AIS tracking,
GPS coordinates, digital logs, and maybe even thermal video. The real question was no longer about having information.
It was about what those files would eventually expose, and more crucially, where this hunt would lead them next.
Around this time,
A major shift was happening out of sight.
the team stopped just looking at the clues they already had on the table.
Instead, they began taking action based on where the trail was pointing.
And when a probe reaches that point, it means the entire game has changed.
Because cyber clues mean nothing by themselves, their true power is showing you where to look next. And if the latest reports are true, fresh forensic data was finally pointing detectives toward very specific spots in the waters around the Bahamas. Spots they wanted to examine closer.
This shift matters because for most of the case, detectives were working backward, combing through records,
Scrutinizing devices.
rebuilding timelines, trying to map out what happened on April 4th.
But now, the team was finally pushing forward, using hard evidence to pinpoint physical sites that might hold key answers.
One particular spot drawing heavy focus is a stretch of the Sea of Abaco near Elbow Cay and Hopetown.
According to reports surrounding the case, investigators cleared the way for new underwater search operations in a zone flagged by their data analysis.
And that tells us something major.
These underwater searches do not happen by accident. They are incredibly costly, slow,
And logistically difficult, especially when several different police agencies are involved.
Before authorities pour cash into a search site, they need a solid reason rooted in hard evidence.
And by this point, proof was what they were following. Not rumors, not online theories, just pure evidence.
because every spot detectives choose to dive represents a vital question they need answered. What happened here?
Why does this spot matter? And is there something lying beneath the waves that can explain the night Lynette vanished?
Meanwhile, behind the scenes, another quiet investigative step was unfolding, getting far less press than the GPS logs or the transponder blackout, but carrying massive weight. Federal agents requested DNA samples from the close family of Lynette Hooker.
At first glance, that sounds incredibly alarming.
But it is actually standard protocol for active missing person cases.
Especially when search operations drag on. DNA profiles let investigators make a positive match if any physical evidence or remains are ever recovered. It is simply one of the most effective tools in their kit. And while gathering DNA does not guarantee a grim outcome, it shows exactly how seriously federal authorities are treating this case.
Because at this point, this was not just a simple search for a missing person. It was an active mission to uncover the truth.
And that difference is crucial when looking at the overall response.
Just look at the players involved. The Coast Guard Investigative Service,
The FBI, federal forensic teams,
and local police, all pulling different threads of the exact same case.
some tracking physical clues, others dissecting digital data, and more coordinating complex search teams and forensic reconstructions. On their own, none of these clues give us a smoking gun.
But together, they reveal a clear pattern.
Detectives are not betting on just one piece of evidence.
They are building layers, transponder logs, GPS coordinates,
Onboard electronics, search coordinates, forensic tests, and DNA profiles, with every single piece tightening up the timeline.
because that is ultimately what this case is now, a complete reconstruction.
An effort to track where everyone was, what actually happened, and whether the physical proof matches the official story told to the public. By this point, detectives had gathered far more evidence than they ever had since the case began. But cold data alone cannot solve a mystery.
It has to be linked, verified, and woven into a sequence that finally makes sense.
And that is precisely what investigators seem to be doing, piece by piece, location by location,
record by record, hunting for answers to a mystery that still lingers months after Lynette Hooker vanished.
What really happened on that night of April 4th? Because the deeper detectives dug, the more obvious one thing became. This was no longer a simple search for a missing person. It was a battle over a timeline. And that crucial timeline grew tighter with every new scrap of evidence they recovered. Let us go back to the start. April 4th, 2025, Hopetown, Bahamas. A husband and wife set off from shore in a small dinghy. It should have been a routine run for them, a short trip they had made countless times before.
Just a quick ride back to the sailboat they called home.
But somewhere between Hopetown and the Soulmate, something went wrong. According to Brian Hooker's story, Lynette entered the water. He claims she was carrying the dinghy ignition key and says the engine could no longer be started. He claims he desperately tried to reach her, and he says the wind and currents pushed them apart until she vanished. That is where this mystery truly begins. But that is definitely not where this investigation ends. Because once detectives analyzed the evidence, focus shifted from human memory to what digital technology actually recorded. First was the timestamp at 9:29 p.m., the exact moment the Soulmate stopped broadcasting its AIS data. Then, the 11-hour gap, a total blackout of tracking data during the most critical window of the case. Next came the GPS findings. Data pulled directly from a marine navigation app. Data that sources say did not match the hand-drawn maps Brian Hooker originally gave to the police. Then came the seizure of the boat itself, as federal agents took custody of the Soulmate. Examining its navigation systems, combing through digital records, and analyzing electronics designed to keep logs long after a boat returns to shore. And finally, focus shifted to the onboard infrared camera, a night vision device that could have filmed events in the dark, which investigators targeted for a deep forensic analysis. When you piece all of these clues together, a pattern starts to emerge. Not a final conclusion, not a verdict, but a pattern. A pattern of detectives trusting objective, hard evidence far more than any individual story about what went down. Because that is exactly what this case is now, a hunt for the absolute truth behind the timeline. And right at the center of that timeline lies the very same question that started it all. What really happened during those 11 hours? What went down after that AIS signal vanished? What unfolded between 9:29 p.m. and the next morning? Because despite all the evidence investigators have gathered, those missing hours remain the most critical and mysterious part of the entire puzzle. And we must remember that as of today, we still do not have any final answers. The investigation remains wide open. Forensics are still analyzing evidence. Police haven't reached a final conclusion. Right now, no one stands convicted of any crime regarding Lynette Hooker's disappearance. And the most critical questions remain entirely unanswered.
That's why every single breakthrough matters. Every scrap of data, every forensic test,
Every coordinated search, every single tactical decision, because any one of them could clarify the exact timeline investigators are desperately trying to rebuild. To the public, this seems like a standard missing persons case, but for detectives, it's increasingly about something else entirely. A timeline, one built from GPS logs, AIS data, and electronic devices. Deep forensic analysis, plus potential evidence that hasn't been shared with the public.
It's a timeline starting with a couple departing Hopetown, which changes forever at exactly 9:29 p.m. on April 4th, when the Soulmate suddenly goes dark.
What actually happened during those critical missing hours is still the greatest unsolved mystery in this whole case. Now, I want to hear what you think.
Which clue do you think is the most critical so far?
The AIS blackout, the strange GPS anomalies, the forensics on the boat, or the thermal imaging records they are studying?
Please keep your comments respectful.
Stick only to verified facts, and please remember this involves real people and a family still searching for answers. As any new details break, we'll keep following the evidence wherever it points.